This is the recording for page 21 to 27 in the Human Odyssey book. And make sure you look at the map here, early human migrations, and see where people migrated. And the move to Mesopotamia. By 10,000 BC, the Ice Age was drawing to a close. The last of the vast ice sheets had melted. The air warmed and the climate changed. Lands that had been cold and arid grew warm and moist. Thick forests sprang up in northern Eurasia, where ice had once covered the ground. Meanwhile, the grasslands south and southeast of the Mediterranean Sea dried up and disappeared, forming today's great deserts of the Sahara and Arabian Peninsula. Between these two regions, the forest region in northern Eurasia and the desert region south of the Mediterranean Sea, lay another region. This region was located east of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, east. Ancient Greek travelers called it Mesopotamia, and we still use that name. The name Mesopotamia comes from Greek words that mean between rivers. This important region was given that name because it lay between two rivers, the Tigris in the east and the Euphrates in the west. Okay, here's the Tigris in the east, Euphrates in the west. Mesopotamia is part of an area that today we call the Middle East. So here's the Middle East. The Middle East is situated at the crossroads of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Middle East is usually defined as stretching from Turkey in the north to Yemen in the south, and from Egypt in the west to Iran in the east. On the map below, locate the Middle East. Locate the region called Mesopotamia. Locate the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Into what body of water do these rivers flow? Northern Mesopotamia, with its mountains, hills, and fertile plateaus, was the life-giving part of the Middle East. Okay, the northern part. The land and climate gave people many choices. The summers were long, hot, and dry, just as they are today. The winters were mild and rainy, just as they are today. The melting snow from the mountaintops kept rivers and streams flowing throughout the year. Wild grasses such as wheat and barley grew in the spring and then dried up under the hot summer sun. In the winter, however, rains brought them back to life. Trees grew among the grasses and along the river banks. Oak, pine, and cedar covered the sides of the hills and low mountains, and you can kind of see an idea of that with this picture right here. By 10,000 BC, people were leaving the desert region south of the Mediterranean Sea in search of better lands. So as you can see, here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here's south, see the Arabian Desert, or the Syrian Desert is right here, okay? And then there's a desert right here as well. Some of these people moved north and west into the forest region. Others moved into northern Mesopotamia. There, along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, human beings learned little by little to control their physical environment. They learned they did not have to be constantly on the move. They could plant wild grasses and harvest the grain. They could tame wild animals and use their herds for meat. How did these huge changes come about? Well, the first farmers. Great changes seldom take place all at once. Human beings were not hunters and gatherers one day, then farmers and herders the next. That change took place very slowly and almost always near river valleys, where the first producers of food had a helping hand from Mother Nature. The first people to produce food were probably women, well before 65,000 or 6500 BC in the Middle East. Women learned to cut the wheat and barley grasses growing wild along the hillsides. Next, the women made an important discovery. They learned that if they let some of the ripe grain seeds drop to the ground, more grasses would grow in that place the next year. Eventually, the women learned that they could sow these seeds in fields where such grasses did not usually grow. And let's read this little box here. Mesopotamia today. Mesopotamia, the ancient hub of civilization, straddles three modern nations: southeastern Turkey, eastern Syria, and a large part of Iraq. What made it one region? The Euphrates and Tigris rivers. They flowed south from mountains in Turkey through Syria to the plains of Iraq. So here's Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. All right, so let's go back to the women would sow the seeds using sharp-pointed digging sticks. They could break the ground and plant the seeds. With plentiful water and good luck, they could harvest the life-giving grain to make bread or porridge at season's end. This new endeavor, deliberately planting seeds, was the beginning of farming or agriculture. Some scholars have called this giant step forward an agricultural revolution. Agriculture was a very important change indeed. It meant that human beings were beginning to control their physical environment. People turned out to be very good at that, and soon they tried to improve the way they farmed, expanding the areas in which they could plant. In hilly country between rivers, trees shaded the ground. Few grasses would grow in the shade. That meant the farmers did not have to cut through many tough grass roots. The soil was fairly loose and easy to dig. These early farmers had seen animals eating the bark of trees. The trees died soon afterwards. The early farmers learned from what they saw. They chose a small area and slashed the bark off all the trees that were growing there. They also dug the ground between the trees and planted seeds for grains. They knew that soon the trees would die and their leaves would fall off. The soil around the dead trees would get more sunlight. Then the grains would grow better than ever before. The farmers also learned that fire could be a great help in growing more grain. They often burned the bushes and grass under the dead trees. Then they scattered the ashes, which were rich in nutrients, over the soil. That kind of farming is called slash and burn agriculture. It helped early people keep the soil fertile. By about 3000 BC, agriculture was common in many parts of the world. There were farmers in Europe. There were farmers along the northern coast of Africa. There were farmers in India and China too. Nearly all these farmers planted along the banks of flooding rivers. We'll find out why soon. On a globe or map of the world, find these regions where early farming spread: Europe, the northern coast of Africa, India, and China. And you can find some of them on this particular map. Okay, here's Northern Europe. India is over here. You can also go to the back of your book where you've got lots of maps. And you can find a map of the world back here. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay, China and India, and here's where we're at right now in Mesopotamia in this Arabian Peninsula. So use that world map. And sorry about that. Okay. So the first herders. So now we're on to the first herders. With the development of agriculture, the human population grew. Plentiful harvests of wheat and barley provided more food. Fewer people starved. But the area around the grain fields was not good for wild animals. When people cleared a piece of land, the gazelles, red deer, wild boar, and goats that once roamed these lands lost much of their natural food supply, and so they moved on. As time passed, hunters found fewer and fewer animals to hunt. Hunting had always required great skill. Now, hunters needed even greater skill if they wanted to eat meat. Some men chose to remain hunters and they followed the animals into different regions. Other men, however, began to share in the work of agriculture. Certainly, it was a safer and surer way to get food. Then hunting. Still, others began to catch some of the wild animals that had stayed behind. Instead of killing them, they domesticated them. That is, they tamed the animals and kept them in herds. Like agriculture, domestication was another very important change. Keeping a small herd of goats, sheep, or cattle meant that people could be sure of having meat close at hand. The herders watched the tame goats and cattle feed their young with milk. They thought, why don't we milk the goats and cattle for our own food? Why don't we use the sheep's woolly skin for our clothing? Over the centuries, thoughts like these led many people to become herders. Keeping herds was another way for human beings to gain control over the physical environment. All over the world, in river valleys and rain-watered lands, herders and farmers were changing the way human beings lived. They no longer had to keep moving from one place to another. They could raise their own food and gather in villages. By 4000 BC, herders and farmers in Mesopotamia were opening the way for an even bigger and better change. Herding and farming in Mesopotamia. What was it like to live in northern Mesopotamia about 4000 BC? We don't know many details. We do know that some men and women were living in villages. They tilled the land nearby. Probably they kept a few animals too. Other men and women lived outside the villages and kept herds of animals. These herders, however, did not stay in any one place long enough to farm. They kept moving back and forth to find food and water for their animals. In the summer, they moved to the hills. In the winter, they returned to the low grasslands. Herding became more important in the grassland areas. And let's come down and check this out down here. Man's best and oldest friend. Man's best friend is also his oldest. Descended from wild wolves, dogs may have been tamed as early as 15,000 years ago in East Asia. Records from Mesopotamia show that ancient people of that region hunted with a kind of mastiff. Animals domesticated for meat, milk, hides, and fleece were also descended from wild ancestors and tamed in the late Stone Age. Sheep and goats came first, perhaps around 9000 BC, followed by pigs and cattle. Okay, so here, herding became more important in the grassland areas. There, the tough grass roots made digging difficult for the farmers. In other areas where the soil could be dug up easily, farming became more important. In northern Mesopotamia, herding and farming had become the two important ways of life. People who got all their food by hunting had almost disappeared from the region, following the game animals into other lands. The herders and farmers discovered that they could help each other. The herders could supply meat to the farmers. In their travels, they could also find things that the farmers needed, like stone for tools. In return, the farmers could supply grain to the herders. They could also give them grain stalks left over from their harvest. The stalks made excellent food for the herds of goats, cattle, and sheep. More discoveries. The early farmers had invented a simple spade and hoe. That made their work a little easier than digging with a pointed stick. After a time, farmers also invented a foot plow. This plow had a long curved handle just above the blade. It had a small peg. The farmer would put his foot on the peg and use his weight to push the blade into the ground. The foot plow was a better tool than the digging stick, the spade, or the hoe. Later, one man pulled the plow with a rope. Another man guided and pushed it. Centuries after the first plow was invented, someone got a bright idea. Instead of a man pulling the plow, why not hitch it to an animal instead? Suddenly, there was an easier way to plow the ground. Human beings had learned that by using their minds, they would not have to use their muscles so often. And then let's take a look at this map right here, rainfall in Mesopotamia. And you can see that there's more rain in the northern regions than in the southern regions. And that's where a lot of the farming took place. And that's the end of the reading of pages 21 to 27.